Welcome to Dialogue. Today we are diving headfirst into a truly radical decision made by a major nation, one that has effectively put up a digital fence around its youngest citizens.
A very, very high fence.
We are talking about Australia's bold and frankly absolutely uncompromising move to ban social media access for kids under the age of 16.
And this isn't just a light touch regulation. This is the equivalent of a national digital scorched earth policy.
It really is. It forces us to ask some deep questions about what we value most. Is it access or is it attention?
It is the ultimate digital intervention, and it provides such a critical case study for the rest of the world. I mean, when you see a country decide to go full Mad Max, as some of the commentary put it,
Which is such a perfect description.
isn't it? Throwing out the entire rule book and adopting these extreme measures on platforms like TikTok, Instagram, even Snapchat. You just have to stop and analyze the root cause.
Right. What gets you to that point?
Exactly. Our mission today is not just to relay the policy specifics. We need to analyze the extreme justifications cited in the sources, the really severe societal symptoms they were observing, and then, critically, look at the immediate and surprising real-world impacts of this forced digital detox.
So we're really trying to understand the tipping point. The moment a modern society decides that the very tools that define modern life are, for a certain part of the population, a toxic hazard.
A hazard that requires this level of intervention.
And this isn't just some legislative tweak. You said it. This is a cultural earthquake. For those of us who grew up alongside the rise of the internet, seeing this level of national panic over information overload shows just how urgent this conversation has become.
It does. They looked out at the youth experience, saw what they termed the digital outback.
Another great phrase.
A hostile, lawless environment dominated by distraction, and they decided the only way to save the citizens was to reclaim the territory entirely.
So let's start with that diagnosis. How did they get there? What was the evidence that scrolling had become the national nemesis?
Well, the initial diagnosis was, on the surface, simple, but actually profound. It was rooted in this perceived belief that a silent war was underway.
A war for what?
For attention, for the future. And the nation was losing. And the real kicker is who they were losing it to. Not to a conventional threat, not another country.
But to 15-second lip sync video.
Exactly. To the endless, highly personalized feed of ephemeral stories and short-form content.
That framing a silent war, it sounds dramatic, but when you look at how the sources frame it, it makes sense. They saw the loss in terms of national productivity, future economic viability, and most urgently, psychological health.
Absolutely. This wasn't just about kids browsing online instead of doing their homework. It was about these core, fundamental shifts in how young people spent their time, exercised their minds, and formed relationships. It was a genuine crisis of attention.
So let's get into the specifics of that, this idea of a behavioral sink they observed.
Right, and that's a term used to describe what happens when a population gets too dense and social norms just break down. In this case, the density was digital. The problem went far beyond simple media consumption. The sources highlight three massive, observable shifts in youth behavior.
And these were the warning sirens for legislators.
And for parents. These shifts led them to conclude that the cost of just letting kids participate in this online world was way too high.
So what's the first one? I imagine has to do with school.
Predictably, yes. The first was the neglect of academic responsibilities. We're talking about homework just not getting done, assignments being submitted late, and this pervasive decline in the cognitive bandwidth you need for sustained study.
And that goes deeper than just procrastination, right? It's not just a choice to put it off.
No, it's about the inability to maintain focus. The brain was being constantly primed for novelty for the next little hit of information. That makes a long-form, complex task, like reading a textbook or solving an equation, feel. Well, it feels unbearable by comparison.
The brain is basically rewired for distraction.
That's a perfect way to put it. And that cognitive fatigue ties directly into the second major point, the physical disconnect. The sources summarize it really simply as kids just not going outside.
They were substituting the real world for the screen.
And think about what that trait is. You're swapping the rich, complex, unpredictable stimuli of the physical world.
Sunlight, fresh air, the unexpected challenge of a spontaneous game.
All of that for the highly curated, synthetic, and predictable reality of the screen. Think about the complexity of processing a three-dimensional physical environment versus staring at a flat, bright screen. One builds spatial reasoning and resilience, the other just optimizes for an immediate, low-effort reward.
And when the default mode for a developing brain switches permanently to the screen, you're missing out on all these essential developmental inputs.
It's just gone.
The third point, though, is the one that really gets me. It underscores the severity of the disconnection, and it has this sort of tragic humor to it.
It does.
The observation that kids weren't even arguing with their parents anymore. They were just passively scrolling.
That is perhaps the most frightening symptom of the behavioral sink.
Why? Because arguing is actually healthy.
It's vital, especially for teenagers. It's a high-stakes form of social interaction. It requires active engagement, being present, the rapid deployment of language and emotional intelligence, testing boundaries.
It's necessary developmental friction.
It's taxing, yes, but it builds conflict resolution skills. It forces emotional maturity. When that basic friction just disappears and is replaced by passive, solitary scrolling, you realize the emotional engagement required for family and social life has been successfully routed, or just bypassed by the device.
So the child is physically there, but psychologically they've checked out.
Completely absent. The social fabric was fraying at the most basic level because the effort required for real interaction was being diverted entirely to the easy reward of the feed.
So when the government commentary introduced that framing device of the digital outback, they weren't being overly dramatic?
No, they were saying that society had slipped into a hostile, lawless environment where the default state for the young was isolation, distraction, and a pervasive lack of focus.
All driven by technologies designed to monetize their attention.
Which led them to the only logical conclusion, in their view.
To go full Mad Max on the problem, it was just highlights how desperate they felt to reclaim their children from what they saw as this abyss of constant digital engagement.
It really speaks to a profound frustration that I think is shared by parents globally, but where other nations might debate incremental regulation.
Better parental controls, adding warning labels, that sort of thing.
Australia decided to perform radical surgery on the problem. They viewed these platforms, particularly their algorithmic delivery and monetization structure, as fundamentally incompatible with healthy cognitive and social development under a certain age.
They saw it as something that required immediate amputation, not slow, cautious therapy.
That's it, exactly.
Okay, let's unpack that. Moving past the behavioral symptoms, the government had to provide explicit, evidence-based justifications for such an extreme policy. The sources point to three major pillars, three specific areas where the platforms were cast as the boogeyman.
Right, and this provides the critical context for why they felt this level of intervention was necessary over any less restrictive measure.
The first one is the one we hear about most often, mental health.
The absolute cornerstone of the justification was the undeniable psychological toll being documented. The data they were tracking showed a terrifying confluence of adverse outcomes directly linked to unchecked platform use among adolescents.
Not just linked, but skyrocketing. Anxiety was described as skyrocketing.
And that was across multiple demographics of young users. Paired with that, you had essential physiological metrics just collapsing. Depression levels were rising steadily.
And sleep was falling dramatically.
Yeah.
The quality, the quantity, everything.
Which we know creates this vicious cycle, right? Sleep deprivation exacerbates mental health issues, which in turn drives more platform use as a coping mechanism, and the cycle just repeats.
But the most visceral summary of this crisis was the state of self-esteem. It was noted as sinking to the Mariana Trench.
That analogy is just chilling, because it suggests self-esteem wasn't just low, it was nearly undetectable, submerged in a place where very few things can survive.
And this dive into inadequacy is fueled by the mechanism of the platforms themselves. It's not an accident.
Not at all. It's by design. The algorithm favors peak moments, filtered bodies, manufactured perfection. That means the user is constantly subjected to an unachievable benchmark, not a diverse representation of reality. And this maximizes engagement by triggering comparison and this feeling that you need to self-correct.
And that constant, unfair comparison brings us to a really specific and painful example: body dysmorphia.
Yes. The commentary uses this with some very dark humor, imagining a parent leaving a one-star review for social media.
Tried this app, gave my kid body dysmorphia, would not recommend.
The humor is an attempt to mask a terrifying reality. When young, developing minds already wrestling with identity, are constantly benchmarked against algorithmic perfection, whether it's filtered faces, extreme fitness regimes, or unattainable wealth. That gap between the user's reality and the screen's fantasy becomes a breeding ground for self-hatred.
Body dysmorphia is a tangible physical consequence of this.
And the sources indicated that the sheer volume of exposure to filtered imagery and surgical trends among young users was overwhelming clinical resources. So the government basically determined that removing the source of the trauma was a more effective public health measure than just treating the resulting psychological injury over and over again.
Which brings us to the second pillar, and this is where it gets really unnerving, I think, for anyone who uses these platforms daily. The government didn't just target the content.
No, they targeted the mechanism of delivery. They identified the algorithm itself as the central villain.
Using that metaphor of a giant, invisible Aussie spider crawling over a child's brain.
It's such a potent image. It speaks to the perceived invasiveness, the secrecy, the predatory nature of the technology. It's this unseen threat that spins a web tailored perfectly to ensnare the user's most vulnerable attention and emotional states.
And the source material gets very specific about what this digital spider tracks. It's frighteningly intimate.
It goes way beyond simple preference logging. Yes, they track what users like, that's standard, but they also track what users fear.
And how do they do that? How does an algorithm track fear?
It tracks micro-reactions, dwelling time on content related to social exclusion, content that provokes anxiety, or content related to self-doubt. By feeding back content that subtly confirms or exacerbates those fears, they deepen engagement through emotional arousal. It keeps the user in this state of high cognitive alert.
But the most invasive detail had to do with late-night habits.
That's the one. The algorithm allegedly knows, for example, that a child watched a slime video or was doom-scrolling about world crises at 2 a.m. when they should have been asleep.
And that detail isn't just about logging a preference for slime videos.
No, it's about timing and context. It's about leveraging a state of low judgment. At 2 a.m., your prefrontal cortex, the center of rational decision-making, is fatigued. Your resistance is down. The platforms have unfettered access to embed compulsive habits and deep preferences.
And the content that works best late at night is often the lowest effort, most emotionally compelling, or most anxiety-inducing.
This is a crucial implication for all of us, not just kids. The Australian government was essentially declaring that these tools are not neutral fun. They are highly sophisticated tracking mechanisms designed with specific economic goals that override human developmental health.
They concluded that the fundamental business model, which profits from psychological manipulation and data harvesting during vulnerable hours, is simply too powerful and too dangerous to be allowed access to immature developing brains.
It wasn't just about bad content. It was a rejection of an entire extractive business model.
Which leads to the final pillar. This one is more about a profound cultural shift that a lot of nations are grappling with: the rise of influencer culture.
For some young people, the primary career aspiration had distilled down to one thing: being TikTok famous, becoming an influencer.
A job that requires mastering the attention economy, not mastering a tangible skill.
And this is where the policy intervention becomes a clear statement about national values and economic priorities. The government looked at this massive redirection of ambition away from engineering, healthcare, trade skills, public service, to content creation, and they saw a threat.
A threat to the long-term societal workforce, a threat to tangible economic capital.
There's this humorous but deeply serious sketch idea referenced in the sources about an Australian career counseling session. The young person says their aspiration is to be TikTok famous.
And the counselor's response is to throw a boomerang at the phone and declare, "Wrong answer, you're becoming a tradie."
That sketch just encapsulates the tension perfectly. A tradie, a tradesperson, a plumber, electrician, carpenter represents a tangible skill, an immediate contribution to physical infrastructure, reliable employment.
So the government was signaling a desire to redirect the focus of its youth back toward these concrete, high-value skills.
The obsession with digital fame was seen not just as a harmless hobby, but as a severe misallocation of youthful energy and ambition. They were moving away from economically and societally valuable pursuits and toward this unstable, highly concentrated lottery system of attention.
The calculation was that a nation needs functional infrastructure built by skilled people far more than it needs another person reviewing obscure products in front of a ring light.
It wasn't a moral judgment. It was about national human capital management.
So after diagnosing the problem, the mental health crisis, the predatory algorithm, the warped career aspirations, the Australian government deployed the radical solution.
A total ban on social media access for kids under 16.
And the specificity here is important. It wasn't a soft-touch solution like a curfew or a usage restriction. It was a total denial of access.
Which raises the immediate and crucial question of legislative logic. Why 16? Why that specific age is the cutoff?
The sources address this with a bit of a wink, describing 16 as the magical age when teenagers supposedly develop enough brain cells to exercise discretion.
And not immediately post their entire personal lives online.
Right. But that humor is masking a very serious neurological justification, isn't it?
Absolutely. That humorous framing is really referencing the concept of cognitive maturity.
Mm.
Specifically, it's about the development of the prefrontal cortex.
The part of the brain responsible for executive functions.
Planning, abstract thought, risk assessment, impulse control, understanding long-term consequences.
Right.
And this area is famously the last to fully mature, often well into our mid-20s.
So legislators concluded that before 16, teenagers simply lack the neurological infrastructure to properly manage the complexities and the permanence of an online footprint.
They are fundamentally incapable of accurately assessing the long-term risk of digital permanence. The idea that a fleeting post can follow them for decades.
So the ban isn't just about protecting them from bad content today, it's about protecting their entire adult future from the impulsive decisions of their 13-year-old selves.
Decisions they literally cannot neurologically comprehend the consequences of. The dramatic reenactment described in the source's parliament arguing whether 15-year-olds are mentally capable of managing their digital lives and concluding probably not.
It injects humor, but it emphasizes the seriousness of how they viewed that immaturity.
15-year-olds struggle acutely with delayed gratification and future forecasting, which are essential for responsible, self-regulated digital use.
But let me play devil's advocate here. Isn't this fundamentally paternalistic? What if a 15-year-old is using social media responsibly, maybe to build a photography portfolio or connect with a niche academic group? Is the government not punishing them alongside the addicted ones?
That is the core conflict. And the government's implicit defense, based on the sources, is one of public health triage. They argued that the system isn't designed to support responsible niche use. It's designed to maximize mass addiction and data extraction. Therefore, the few examples of responsible use do not outweigh the catastrophic documented harm to the vast majority.
So they prioritized collective developmental health over individual digital autonomy for that specific age range.
They drew a hard line in the sand. They determined that self-regulation was an impossible expectation given the powerful psychologically optimized design of the platforms. And therefore, external mandatory regulation was the only viable public policy solution.
So a policy like that is implemented. You expect high drama. And the immediate reactions, they certainly delivered.
Oh, absolutely. It was a tale of two generations. The visceral relief and celebration from parents contrasted sharply with the nuclear-level outrage from the youth.
Let's start with the parents. The reaction was described in almost euphoric terms.
The comparison was to celebrating like it's the World Cup. This wasn't relief over a minor inconvenience. This was liberation. Liberation from years of frustrating, exhausting, and often fruitless attempts to manage their children's digital habits.
And the imagery used is fantastic. Parents dancing around bonfires of old smartphones.
Fathers cracking beers, mothers chanting "no more TikTok dances in my kitchen." It just illustrates the pervasive nature of the platform's intrusion into the home. The ban effectively outsourced the difficult, constant job of digital enforcement from the individual parent to the state.
It wasn't just abstract relief, though. There's that one painfully specific anecdotal detail from a mother.
The one who claimed she hadn't seen her daughter's forehead in 4 years.
Right, because of the angle kids hold their phones while they're constantly scrolling.
And that detail is just devastatingly specific. It illustrates the physical manifestation of digital separation. The child was literally retreating behind the phone, not just psychologically, but physically, blocking off basic forms of communication.
So the parent celebrating wasn't celebrating a legislative win. They were celebrating the return of their child's face, the potential for eye contact.
The possibility of an unmediated moment. It reveals the depth of the physical and emotional barrier the device had created.
Okay, so on the other side of that equation, the youth.
The reaction was extreme, described as taking caffeine away from adults. But worse, way worse, nuclear-level meltdown.
It helps you understand the sheer emotional and social dependency that had been established. For these kids, social media wasn't an optional leisure activity.
No, it was the essential utility that powered their entire social ecosystem.
And the outbursts weren't just complaints. They were expressions of profound injustice, often using adult language about freedoms they felt they were entitled to.
Exactly. You have the specific example of a 13-year-old yelling, "This is a violation of my human rights."
Which to them felt true.
Because for that generation, social media is the core infrastructure of their social life, their identity formation, their information flow. To have it removed is perceived as existential censorship.
The sources also mention kids trying to smuggle phones like contraband.
Treating the ban like a prohibition era on their personal freedoms.
Yeah.
And then you have the dramatic diary entry, "Today, democracy died."
Which is so illustrative of the generational gulf. But it does raise the question of digital rights for minors. Is that a real discussion?
It is. Globally, policy discussions are growing around whether minors possess a fundamental right to access and participate in the digital sphere.
Mm.
However, the Australian legislators' rebuttal was that those rights are secondary to the government's protective duty, especially when the vehicle for exercising that right, the platform, is demonstrably harmful.
And the adult response and the commentary to that outrage is just perfect.
Democracy die, honey. You weren't even alive during dial-up internet.
It just highlights that vast difference in how digital consumption is valued and understood across generations, a difference that required legislative force to reconcile. With the policy implemented and the initial chaos subsiding, the focus shifted to the results. And this is where the story gets its validation. The data showed the policy was generating immediate, tangible, positive shifts, the green shoots of a reclaimed childhood.
The first observable change was the return to the physical world, often termed the touching grass phenomenon. Kids were observed going outside again, but it wasn't casual. It was described as treating physical interaction with nature like a sacred ritual.
Which suggests that the prior level of immersion was so complete that the physical world had become alien or novel to them.
It's a testament to how much time was being spent indoors and online. This forced re-engagement is so essential. The physical world is messy, complex, requires high-level sensory processing. The digital world is optimized for low-friction scrolling.
And the humorous detail here really drives it home. The anecdote of a child picking up a stick and asking, "Is this a real-life item?"
That anecdote, while obviously exaggerated for effect, is a profound indictment of the pre-ban condition. It shows that the child's concept of reality had been almost entirely substituted by the digital interface. A simple stick, one of the most basic foundational objects of childhood play, was exotic,
The ban forced a massive cognitive recalibration.
shifting their attention span back to the complexity and imperfection of the immediate environment, fostering engagement with sensory inputs that screens just can't replicate.
This shift wasn't just physical, it was cognitive, and it had a massive immediate impact on academic success.
This is the data point that really validates the policy. Homework completion rate went up by 200%.
200%. That's not a minor improvement. That's a structural reversal of prior behavioral trends.
It is the clearest validation of the hypothesis that constant access to social media acts as a devastating cognitive inhibitor. Our analysis attributes this increase to the cessation of the constant dopamine drip.
But let's go deeper on that. How does that dopamine drip actually stop a kid from doing homework?
It's a mechanism of high frequency and low investment. The brain is geared towards efficiency. When faced with a difficult task, like homework, which requires deep work and delayed gratification, it seeks the path of least resistance and highest reward.
And social media provides near instantaneous, high-frequency, low-effort dopamine hits.
Which trains the brain's reward pathways to demand quick returns and actively resist the sustained cognitive effort required for studying. So it's not just the time spent scrolling that's the problem.
It's the brain training that makes hard work feel intolerable.
Exactly. And every notification, every quick check, imposes what's called a task switching cost. When you switch your attention from deep work, like algebra, to shallow work, like checking a notification, it takes a significant amount of time and energy to fully re-engage with the complex task.
And social media forces dozens of those high-frequency task switches per hour.
So by removing that infinite source of instant gratification, the ban reduced what you could call induced ADHD symptoms, the constant need to check, to scroll, to switch attention. It allowed the prefrontal cortex to regain control.
And that restoration of cognitive bandwidth is what allowed for sustained academic effort.
The anecdotal evidence from the sources, the teacher reporting, "Billy finally turned in homework," and the principal fainting, is a hilarious representation of institutional shock at this return to normalcy.
Beyond academics, the social landscape also underwent a dramatic shift. Kids started talking to each other in person again.
It sounds like something out of period drama, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But the ban forced direct, non-mediated communication.
And the sources highlight the novelty of eye contact.
There's a brilliant, highly exaggerated detail. Gen Z and Gen Alpha discovered eye contact for the first time, leading to some fainting. And while humorous, this exaggeration hits at a genuine behavioral phenomena, the atrophy of nonverbal communication skills.
Nonverbal cues, eye contact, posture, vocal tone, that's incredibly high bandwidth communication. And digital mediation just strips all of that away.
Replaces it with low bandwidth text, emojis, and highly edited videos that provide minimal, genuine emotional context. When direct communication is enforced, young people have to rebuild those complex skills reading emotion in real time, managing awkward silences, initiating conversation without the crutch of the screen.
It's essential for developing robust social intelligence and empathy.
The schools observed a sudden burst of spontaneous, messy, in-person social activity that had been functionally absent for years.
But one of the most unexpected side effects was the reduction in digital toxicity. Bullying dropped by 60%.
A monumental, society-altering shift. And the mechanism behind it suggests a very clear conclusion about the nature of digital aggression versus physical confrontation.
The sources explain that without the digital Hunger Games of subtweeting and anonymous harassment, teenagers were forced to attempt in-person interaction.
Or if they were still inclined toward aggression, they had to attempt in-person bullying, like the 90s. And what you see is that the threshold for aggression is significantly higher when it requires physical presence.
You can't hide behind a screen.
Exactly. Subtweeting or anonymous posting removes the natural break of empathy and dramatically lowers the behavioral cost. You don't see the victim's tears, you don't face immediate social reprisal.
But when aggression requires eye contact, the behavioral cost, the psychological discomfort, the risk of confrontation, the visibility of the act, it all rises sharply.
And that acts as a powerful deterrent. The bully-victim dynamic is fundamentally altered when the screen shield and the veil of anonymity are removed.
And finally, there was the structural side effect on the schools themselves. They stopped being content farms.
Which led to the restoration of institutional dignity. No more constant hallway dance videos being filmed during class transitions. No more teachers being secretly recorded.
It's a subtle but important point. When every school moment becomes potential content, the primary focus shifts from learning to performance and digital validation.
The ban restored the school's primary purpose by removing that powerful digital incentive structure.
So this action, going full Mad Max, didn't happen in a vacuum. Once Australia pushed this button, the entire world sat up and took notice.
Australia basically became a reality TV show being watched internationally, and it prompted vastly different reactions based on economic priorities and political will.
France, for instance, expressed open consideration. Maybe we should do this too.
Which suggests a continental willingness to consider significant regulatory action, prioritizing the state of the youth over platform revenue.
Contrast that with the reaction from the U.S.
The cynical but perhaps brutally honest statement, LOL, no, kids run our economy.
It's a pragmatic appraisal of U.S. policy. The massive economic infrastructure built around youth consumption, advertising revenue, trend creation means any measure threatening that engine is a non-starter.
For the U.S., the youth user base isn't just consuming. They're driving trillions in valuations. The economic priority far outweighs the social costs.
Then you have the U.K., characterized by legislative fatigue.
We're too tired to legislate anything right now. It captures a sense of institutional inertia. They see the problem, but the political will for such a massive intervention is lacking.
And finally, Japan.
Who noted partial adoption already. We banned half of this already. This indicates that some cultures had already implemented selective constraints, possibly mitigating the need for such a drastic, comprehensive ban.
Australia's move was precedent-setting because of its uncompromising breadth.
And its total rejection of the established digital status quo.
But the global reaction that matters most, perhaps, is the panic in Silicon Valley.
Oh, utter distress. The sources paint a picture of panic among tech executives, stemming from a direct existential threat to their core business model. The Australian market might be relatively small, but the regulatory precedent was terrifying.
And this distress was driven by specific, measurable economic fears.
All tied to stock valuations and quarterly reports. First, the loss of user base and login time. The collective executive scream was imagined as, what do you mean the kids can't log in? It's a direct hit on daily active users, the lifeblood of their stock price.
Second, the threat to content consumption volume.
Who will watch the 7 billion hours of pointless content we produce every day? This reveals the underlying philosophy. Volume over quality, addiction over utility, Removing the most compulsive segment of that audience creates a quantifiable hole in the content ecosystem.
And finally, the loss of microtransactions.
The panic manifested as, who will buy our $1.99 emoji packs? And while that's humorous, it highlights how much revenue is aggregated from small, impulse purchases made by younger users who are less fiscally cautious.
When you take away that highly compulsive segment, the whole monetization strategy wobbles.
To Silicon Valley, the Australian ban wasn't a social experiment. It was an existential economic crisis, a catastrophic regulatory infection that could spread. They understood instantly that the success metrics of Australian childhood development were directly inverse to their own stock price.
So we circle back to the core philosophy behind this entire approach. They looked at a generation sinking into digital addiction and cognitive fatigue, and they concluded that the cost was intolerable.
And the decision was driven by this powerful foundational desire to prioritize brains, not with ring lights. They prioritized deep, sustained cognitive development over passive, shallow consumption.
It was an unapologetic assertion of parental authority at the national level.
Australia went first, they went bold, and they did it with an uncompromising assertiveness that shocked global regulatory bodies. They bet on human potential, not technological efficiency.
And the results, that dramatic 60% drop in bullying, the 200% rise in homework completion, are powerful, measurable data points that you just can't dismiss.
They suggest that the platforms, in their current design, are fundamentally toxic to formative human development and attention spans.
Which brings us to the final provocative thought we have to leave you with.
If forced abstinence from social media in formative years, years when the brain is still actively wiring itself for focus and social skills, produces such immediate and tangible positive shifts, what responsibility do adult users have in regulating their own digital consumption habits?
The ban created a mandatory reset button for kids.
But for us, the adults who choose to maintain the constant dopamine drip, the question becomes, are we actively compromising our own focus, our mental bandwidth, our creativity, and our social depth? Are we just accepting the behavioral sink that was deemed intolerable for the younger generation?
Are we the unwitting adults who desperately need our own state-mandated timeout? A tough question to sit with as we all pick up our phones again. If you enjoyed this conversation, please like, subscribe, and share this video. Also, let us know in the comments what really stood out to you in this conversation, and if there's any related topic or new topic that you would like covered in a future video.